Well, thank you for joining me today. So today I'd like to hear your thoughts on our food supply chain in the context of your book, The Secret Life of Groceries. With that being said, my first question is, you've stated that some of the largest grocery stores have over 100,000 items. To me, this suggests that there's a tremendous excess in our food waste system. Food waste is a major problem around the world, with up to 1/3 of all food produced being wasted. How can we address this issue and ensure that we are using our resources in a sustainable and responsible way, while also ensuring food security for all?
Yeah, it's a great question. Like the optionality at the grocery store and the food waste question are probably linked, but less so than you'd think. I think what really drives food waste is this expectation that those options will be continuously available at any time, any place. I mean, that's the real miracle of the grocery store is not just the number of possible choices, and not just their abundance in terms of quantity, but that you go into the store at any given time and there's this regularity. Right? It's a nightmare of the supermarket manager to have a stock out, which is like an item or where there's none of it available, because they're terrified you'll just go walk down the street to the next grocery store if you find what you can't get what you want. So tying that to food waste, though, it sets up all these expectations down the chain that things will be continuously available, and that you're catering to kind of consumer whims, which, in the case of ugly fruits and vegetables, has kind of been made in the popular mind many times over. And so you get like fruits, perfectly edible food, rejected because it doesn't have aesthetic qualities, which is very, very old part of the process. I think the continuous production aspect just puts a tightness on the entire supply chain that, really a lot of the food waste happens when grocers can't budget where your consumer demand is going to lie. And this happens in all retail all over the place, but most things aren't perishable. And so when you're operating a grocery store on the principles of a department store selling shirts, when you have too many of a shirt that's kind of expired, you lose some money, but the shirt doesn't go to waste. It can be sold at a cheaper price later. It can be held in excess, it could go to a discounter. With food, that's not the case, and it just rots. And so, that's a big piece of where the food waste problem begins. I will say, food waste is not something that I intentionally kind of steered away from it in the book, because I felt like I didn't. There's a certain moralizing quality to food waste that I think is very attractive from the outside. But when you actually see how the supply chain is run, meeting those demands just necessitates a certain margin of error that is the food waste. And so I guess I felt like it was more helpful to focus on what consumers were demanding, and kind of put the onus of the waste on people at the register, rather than these kind of like cloaked forces in the supply chain who aren't handling the product properly.
Mhm.
Long answer.
Yeah, so supermarkets often prioritize profits over the well-being of the environment as well. So how can we shift the priorities of the grocery industry to ensure that food security and sustainability are at the forefront?
Yeah, another $1 million question that I don't think anyone's quite cracked. I mean, you're absolutely correct in saying that profits tend to come out of two places, one of which is the environment, one of which is labor. And the entire name of the game in grocery and in most retail is how do you outcompete your rival chain, and you do that by it's all based on lowering price and price comparisons. And so people at the registers are searching for better deals, buyers in the grocery store are searching for better deals, and that puts a lot of pressure on manufacturers to search for better deals and get a lower price. And all these price cuts in food in particular, there just aren't revolutionary new agricultural systems being developed. There was a revolution in supply chain logistics, and maybe there'll be another one with AI, although we saw how buggy some of that can be, that will lead to efficiencies. But there aren't that many efficiencies that are being uncovered every year, and yet suppliers demand a lower price every year. And there are a lot of things that we take as a baseline for food, right? Food safety and quality is something that's kind of non-negotiable. So all the fixed costs in food are very high and very rigid. Like to play the game, to enter the game, you have to meet all these demands around safety and quality. So what the end of the game, the only place to make the cuts are the environment and your workforce. And so that's where the cuts come. To shift that system really, well, one involves creating conduits where consumers are much more in control of what they're buying. Like the kind of mantra, like vote with your dollars, buy the right items and change things, doesn't hold up in the complexity of the supply chain today. There's just too many intermediaries. You don't really know what you're buying. But if you could create a system where there was more direct purchasing from producers, so from farmers directly, like farm market, which is a very inefficient version of that, which is why people don't gravitate towards it. So it's not a solution in itself, but there perhaps is a solution out there with new technology that would make purchasing directly from producers more convenient. I'm a little skeptical of that, but it could be there. And or just old-fashioned regulatory legal apparatus where you set a standard and then you enforce the standard. And we're terrible at that. I mean, we essentially outsource a lot of our food to other countries who have weaker labor laws, weaker environmental protections, precisely to get around that. But if we created a global standard and a global ethic where we said this is, what you can and cannot do, and then enforced it with state power rather than the current way it's enforced, which is through a for-profit auditing regime, you could have some results. Sorry if that's a wonky answer.
No, it's good. Thank you. Yeah, so you just mentioned somewhat how challenges faced by small scale farmers in the face of large corporations. So how can we support these farmers and promote sustainable agriculture while also ensuring food security for all?
Yeah, I mean, I would challenge that notion to some extent. Look, I love the small family farm. My grandparents helped run a milk farm in upstate New York. It's certainly a beautiful thing, but the idea that there's something uniquely good about a small farm, in my mind, doesn't hold up to much scrutiny. Just because you're small doesn't mean you're going to care for your animals better. It doesn't mean that you're going to care for your employees better. You don't magically become a better person because you're located on a smaller piece of property. And frankly, because small producers are so vulnerable in terms of price taking, so they have the least bargaining power in the whole system, most able to be pushed around by kind of middlemen or co-ops. They often have all those pressures on them. They're the most likely to cut corners. Like if you're a small farm, you're not going to have an head of HR managing your employees. You're going to hire 1 to 2 hands, and they're probably going to be who needs work in your area. The incentives to treat those employees fair is actually less for a small farm than it is for a big farm. So to some extent, America, we love our small farms because it's part of this mythology of our country. And I am just as much in love with that mythology, but I think the benefits of scale are real in terms of price making, but they're also real in terms of quality control. And at the end of the day, when we talk about labor standards and we talk about food safety and we talk about environmental standards, you can think of those as another form of quality control. Like the big farms can actually enforce regulations and have more incentive to enforce it because they're a bigger target. It's easier to go in and do punitive action against a big farm than it is to do it against 10,000 small farms. So it's a counterintuitive answer, but I would just kind of challenge people to think more critically about actually solving the problems rather than the mythology of like a small farm.
Thank you. All right, so my last quick question is, so you described before how grocery industries is really shaped by consumer demand. So what can individuals do to support a more equitable and sustainable food system? And what role do you see consumers in promoting food security?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I mean, the short answer is, I think, abandon the notion that you can buy your way to a better future. That's definitely the paradigm I was raised in. This idea that we, again, vote with our dollars, buy the right things, and that's going to help make the world better and save some poor farmer in Bangladesh because I'm purchasing his co-op chocolate or shrimp or whatever that producer is making. I think fundamentally take the energy that you're putting there and start advocating for things like trade unions, labor laws with teeth, environmental regulations that get enforced. Like I think enforcement of all these things. We have a lot of beautiful laws on the books, actually, but there aren't the money to enforce them. The enforcement apparatus is deeply underfunded. And then simultaneously, I do think you can choose avenues that connect you to producers you trust. And so I'm a huge advocate of farm markets. I'm a huge advocate of direct to producer purchasing. I think that's an unreasonable burden for most people. The people who can shop only at farm markets are a privileged set. So it's not a universal solution, but I think it's beautiful. If you're looking for ways to make a difference, that is certainly something that you can do that will probably make a difference. You circumvent the entire supply chain that way. You're putting dollars directly into the pockets of someone that you trust to be doing the right thing. I can't think of anything that's wrong with that, except for it's not scalable. It's not an end game solution. And it does kind of give moral virtue points to people who have the time and the resources to seek that out, where as everyone who's kind of time strapped mother of three looking for a good deal becomes like kind of the bad guy because they go to the store that's right down the street. But like don't let that stop you from doing the right thing. Just don't get sanctimonious about it. I certainly try to shop at farmers markets whenever I can.
Yeah, me as well. All
Yeah.
right. That's it for me.
All
Thank
right,
you so
man. Well,
much.
I salute you.